it really doesn't take you too long in your sewing journey to realize that there is so much assumed knowledge in sewing, right? Like, the pattern doesn't tell you how to do so many things. It's like a whole other language. Even though it might say easy on the envelope, it's not easy. And I kind of always felt like it was roadblock after roadblock, as in you just think that you're getting started, getting through something, and then you hit another hurdle or something else you don't know or understand. And it's just so hard to learn sewing, right? In this video, I want to go through my top 10 tips that I wish someone had told me when I first started sewing to make the process so smoother and easier, and put those things on your radar so you can actually learn how to start sewing clothes. Welcome back, my dear sewing friends. It is always so lovely to see your smiling faces here with me. Welcome. If you're actually brand new here, my name is Evelyn Wood and I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com. And here on this channel, we talk everything about sewing your own clothes. And this is actually part 2 in a 3-part series about how to actually get started sewing your own clothes in 2025. So part 1 was about getting started sewing, like your sewing machine, fabric, like stitches, and just getting started sewing. This one we're focusing on all of the assumed knowledge of sewing, getting started with your first garment, and then part 3 coming up later will be about fitting, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So we've covered getting started with sewing, and now you've like picking up a pattern and you're probably starting your first garments and just thinking, this is so hard, right? You know, regardless if it says easy on the pattern, as we said. And so it's what we call the assumed knowledge of sewing. And so there is so much of this. And let's just talk about what all this kind of is first before we get into the top ones that I think are for you to learn about. So once upon a time, you know, dressmaking was more common knowledge, right? Like more people used to do it every day. It was just part of the world. People knew how to sew. And so these skills, these sewing skills were passed from one seamstress to another, often from mother to daughter to granddaughter. And these skills were passed on. Now, here we are on the internet, and I am like, I don't know, fairy sewist godmother, and passing what I know on to you as well, because this is how we do it in our modern day. So the big thing to think about is the patterns themselves. Like, how and why are these so difficult to learn? Let's rewind a little bit into how patterns came about. So back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, sewing patterns first came out, and they were designed for home dressmakers who already knew how to sew, because as we just talked about, that was common knowledge, to have at home be able to make the latest Paris fashions from the runway or something like that, right? You know, that part's never changed. And so they could bring that pattern, that style home and be able to make it, because pattern drafting is a whole other thing. And that's what they were designed for. As you can imagine, if you already know how to sew, you don't need very much instructions. The instructions were actually non-existent to very, very little. For example, even in my collection, ones from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s even still, patterns are non-printed. They don't have anything printed on the pattern pieces themselves. They're just plain paper, little holes punched here or there for notches and things like that. And the instructions are about, I don't know, 1 paragraph long entirely. It just says things like sew the collar in the usual manner, sew the zip in the usual manner, sew cuffs, sew side seam, and it's really, really scant, let's say that. That's because you just need to know, oh, do the collar first, do the this, do that, and you just put it together, because you know already how to know what the usual way to sew a cuff is, right? Whereas we don't. We pick up a sewing pattern and we're trying to learn how to sew, right, the very first time. No one else showing us. And that's why they were never designed as a learn to sew tool, and why it's quite difficult, and there's so much assumed knowledge. Now these days the patterns are full of information. You know, sewing instructions are very, very detailed and long, and lots of markings written on the pattern, and even sewing terms and all sorts of things in here, but it is still not quite enough to make this a really, really easy experience. There's still so much you need to kind of be aware of and know that I know no one told me about. I had to learn the hard way, and I don't want you to learn the hard way either. So I think now you've set up like why sewing patterns are maybe harder than you think. And it's just, for me, knowing that was then I knew what I needed to learn to be able to use them properly and the way that they are designed. And so that's what made it easier for me when I understood what sewing patterns are. Each of these points I will not go into detail here because I've already made many, many videos in depth on each of these topics. So in the description box down below, you'll find linked video lists of all these things for your further research into them. Okay, so the first one is kind of obvious in that don't assume that the pattern has everything. in it for you to learn how to sew. So there are lots of other things that you need to learn. For instance, you need to learn sewing terms. It's really important. Terms like grainline, facing, fusing, selvages, all these types of things are just terminology that's used in sewing that will be just so beneficial to you when you do learn it, because then you know what the pattern's trying to explain to you. It's like a shortcut of things. So definitely pay attention to that and start writing these things down in your sewing journal and write what they are down. So make a list so you remember what they all are. You need to learn about interfacings. Oh, I remember I was just like doing a pattern, thinking it up, and it's like interface this with this, and I just thought, what's interfacing? I don't know, so I'm just going to skip it and see how it turns out. And of course, it didn't turn out very well, as you might imagine. Interfacings are essential, and just because you don't know what it is, don't skip it. Interfacings is a big one that we all do. So learn about interfacings, the different weights, the different structures that it gives, woven versus fusible, non-fusible, and all of these things. Anyways, that's a whole nother topic for you, but do learn about interfacings. And you do need to learn about seam finishes. So a seam finish is how we finish the raw edges of the fabric. When we sew a seam, you've got those raw edges that are just fraying and disintegrating, and we need to finish them so that they don't fray, because you do not want all of that hard work that you put into making that garment to just fall apart in the wash, right? So we need to finish our seams. I'm going to go ahead and just make this the next one. Don't skip pressing. Honestly, it is like the math doesn't even equate into something pressed and something not pressed, your seams as you make it. The pressed one will look 10 times better than the unpressed one, honestly. And you don't actually need to get better at sewing to make your garments look better. You just need to press it and get better at pressing, and your garments will just look better without any more skills at the sewing machine required. I promise it's like a shortcut to sewing better garments is pressing better. So hot little tip. I really wish someone had told me that, because mine turned out like disasters at the beginning, but could have just been very much less disasters if I had pressed, and particularly press along as you go, like through the process of making the garment. You can't or shouldn't just add more to the side seams to make the size bigger or smaller. So this one is a bit of a minefield in that, you know, I remember I would just, it's a bit too small or too big, and you just kind of take it in at the side seams, right? Or let it out a little bit at the side seams. And while it can work, and you probably will get away with this sometimes, it's generally not the correct way, in that it will lend you into bad habits later on. It will cause problems and you won't know why. Patterns are mathematically worked out in that this side seam around your back fits this side seam on the front, and when they're sewn together, they should be exactly the same. And so that's part of it. And then if you use a different seam allowance, you know, by adding or subtracting on the side, it won't then match the other pieces that garment's sewn to, right? If we just add to the side seam, our sleeve won't fit anymore. Our shoulder seam will be different. And it just, there's only so much you can get away with that it kind of can fudge it, but it just won't. So do understand that patterns are mathematically worked out, and you need to kind of be aware of those things. I really wish someone actually had told me how important fabric choice is. So how we often choose our fabric when we choose it, you know, after our pattern, is that we'll pick something up, and this is a really good example, and we go, look at this, it's beautiful, it's velvet, it's so slinky, and then, oh my goodness, look at this. This actually is probably the most gorgeous fabric I've ever bought. It is a floral silk burnout fabric. It is slinky and velvet, and it's got peacocks on it, and it is gorgeous. So fabric choice plays such a huge role in that if you choose a really difficult fabric like slinky chiffon, thin velvet, or stretch velvet, or, you know, something like this, a difficult fabric, it makes sewing really difficult. And you don't want to learn how to, say, sew a zip on a difficult fabric, because you've got to deal with the difficult fabric, not learn a new skill. And so it comes into two play of how important fabric choice is one, to your skill level, because it's really, you kind of want to start learning at that base level 0. You know, a quilting cotton, something like that is really good to start learning with. You can just learn how to sew all of the other things before you put a difficult fabric, which is a skill in itself, into the mix. And so choosing appropriate fabric for your skill level is important. The other perspective is choosing the incorrect fabric for the design. And so it's always a balance between these two. But say my dress here, for example, if this is a beautiful linen and it has linen has a bit of drape and bounce to it. But so if I had made this same dress out of, say, just a quilting cotton, it wouldn't have the same look and feel. It would be stiffer, more structured. It wouldn't drape as much. Now, this is not right or wrong, but it's just important for you to realize that this really affects how the design looks and how it feels on your body when you've made it up. Fabric is one of the hardest things to learn, but you will learn as you go. It just comes by experience and just really noticing and just putting in the effort to learn about the different fabrics, the fibers, and just how it impacts the garment design, what you like, what you don't, writing it all down in your sewing journey and just taking notes as you go and really focusing on learning fabrics. I wish I had put more effort into that into the start to know that that was something I was going to have to really learn. Definitely don't ignore the Grainline. I think every one of us does this when we start sewing. One, because you hear Grainline and you think, I don't know what that is. So what is the Grainline? The Grainline is indicated mostly by arrows on your pattern with little arrows. It could be on the fold, the center, and it's written, and the Grainline also is in our fabric. It's just like grain in a wood, it's the way the fibers are grown in the wood, right? Is the grain. Same with fabric. If you look really closely, you'll find all of those little tiny threads that your fabric is made up of. Some go this way, some go this way, and they're woven or knitted together, right? This is the grain. So the grain follows both of those thread lines. And so the fabric falls quite differently when, say, it is straight like this, or when it is on the curve and the bias, right? It falls and drapes quite differently, you can see. And so this impacts your garment design hugely. Let's give an example of, say, if you had a print on your fabric. Well, first of all, this is what we often do, right? We'll put a pattern piece here and we'll put a pattern piece there, and we're ignoring the cutting instructions with the Grainline that kind of go hand in hand. And you think, well, that's a waste of fabric. So I'm just going to put this pattern here and squeeze it in this way. And then you put the other one up this way and turn it around here because it fits better. You're going to save fabric and squeeze them all in. Definitely don't do that. The cutting instructions are there for a reason, and it's to follow the Grainline because if your fabric was, say, printed, say we had some little smiley faces on your fabric, right? And you want to cut them all out. You want the smiley faces to go in the one direction, right? You want them to be upwards on this side and the same way on this side. You don't want is this one's to be this way and these to be sideways or upside down or halfway around. And so it's not just with print, the actual fabric itself, if you look really, really closely, it will have a sheen to it. Like when you look one way versus the other, it has a different sheen to it. So it will look different. That pile might be kind of different and furry in different directions, and it will drape differently if it's on straight versus slightly off, even a little bit. You don't want one this way and one slightly this way. You want both sides to be even. And so it's really important to follow the Grainline because of those reasons. I always like to tell you why, because understanding a little bit about why makes you realize why you have to follow them, right? You need to learn the rules before you break them. Test everything first. This one was huge. I didn't realize this until I went to fashion college, that we should really be testing things that we do in our garments before we make them. Because as I learned in fashion college, we'll do a sample of a welt pocket. We'll do a sample of all the different types of zips, right? And then choose which one we want to do in the garment that we're making. It was mind-blowing for me to think, why didn't I ever do this while I was learning how to sew? Before that, because I don't want the first time I'm learning how to do a zip to be on my beautiful, lovely fabric that I love and that it's going to turn out not as good. Because the second time you do something, the second time I did that zip, it's not twice as good, it's 10 times better the second time you do something. So practice, do samples of all these individual little skills. So you have the whole garment that you're making, but it's made up of little individual skills, like the zip, like the collar, like your hem, like your seam finishes, right? So all these little individual parts you're doing, test those out. I still to this day will test my stitches before I sew my fabric, make sure they've got the right ones selected. I will test, if I haven't sewn a welt pocket for ages, I will absolutely do a sample welt pocket with the fabric I'm going to use before I would do it on the garment, because I don't want that first new one to be on the actual garment. I would sample buttonholes every single time on the fabric I'm going to use before I do it to make sure I've got it all worked out before I do my real one on the garment, and you should absolutely do this too. It's really simple. It seems like a lot of work when you're starting because you think, well, I don't want to do that. I just want to get in and make the garment. But if you're looking to make quality clothes that you really like and increase your skills, that is really, really key. This one story of Barbara was one of my first BSS members, like when I first started Vintage Sewing School, and she just was absolute like face palm moment when I was explaining this to her, and like, you know, you can do a sample first and try something. So do a sample, do one of all of the different zips to learn the technique, and then do it in your garment, and then, you know, do it in like bedsheet fabrics and things like that. And she just had mind blow moment because she thought, I never realized, of course I could do a sample first. Of course I should do a sample first. And so I remember she come back to me later telling me how much better her results were with that, along with not just adding things onto the side seams and things like that, were just, you know, she started to see great results after really taking and learning some of these things. So it's really, really important. You're already ahead of the game here. All right. Quickly, one of the next big things is don't just choose your ready-to-wear size. The sizes on the pattern envelopes here have nothing to do with the sizes that are in the stores. So a size 12 that you pick up off the rack in size 12 is not the same size 12 in a pattern, right? These are in US sizes even. I'm in Australia. These aren't even the same thing. And they don't relate to clothing sizes at all. Now that you are a sewist, this is your new mantra, is you do not, it does not matter what the number says. We only use body measurements. You need to measure your body and you use the body chart according to that. I know we all start and we think, oh yeah, I'm usually a size 12, so yeah, I'll make a size 12 and we go from there. It's one of the biggest mistakes, but it's the easiest to avoid. So definitely, if you haven't made your first garment yet, don't make that mistake. Measure yourself first and use that chart to help you guide the size. The next one is don't actually sew up the entire garment all the way through to the end and then try it on for the first time, because it's going to probably not fit you correctly. Now, when you're first starting, this is difficult because fitting is an entirely different skill than sewing, but we will talk more in depth about that next week or in 2 weeks' time in the next video about how to get a better fit, because that is the next stage after you learn all this assumed knowledge and you start sewing your first garments. It is then, how do we fit this and make it better? So that will be coming up. Okay, a couple of things for you before you go. One, I've got some homework for you. What are 3 of these that really struck home with you that you need to learn more? Write them down in the comments below because I'd love to hear it. And also, your homework is to actually practice and study those. Use the hashtag #SewWithEvelyn. I'd love to see your progress on social media. 2, check the description box down below because that is where all of the golden nuggets are, the extra videos on all of these things that you can learn and practice and actually learn how to do all these things that we just talked about. And of course, I would love to help you continue on your sewing journey. Stay tuned for in a couple of weeks' time, we have another video on the fitting coming up. I really look forward to seeing you there. Happy sewing. Bye.